And while the checkpoints is slowly drawing to an end, let us speak a little about what should have been the first largest public-private partnership project, and often called the strategic startup of this country.
And this is definitely Anakleia. Not only a port as referred more commonly, but the whole ecosystem, including Anakleia city as well.
Well, Georgi, it happened what most of us anticipated long before this week. Anakleia Development Consortium filed an arbitration lawsuit against Georgia.
Yes, and it's, as it became known during the official press conference, Bob Meyer, one of the main investors, filed a separate arbitration lawsuit against Georgian government.
The plaintiffs take the decision of the Georgian government about termination of the contract as illegal and demand a restitution of their rights. According to their statement, the demand exceeds $1 billion USD and comprises losses of consortium and Meyer himself.
Ted Jonas will explain more for the viewers of the checkpoints. He's a board member and dwells well into details. We're open to listen to the government as well. The checkpoints is an open platform for all voices. Let's now hear from and more from Ted Jonas.
ADC decided to go to arbitrage.
Yes.
What pushed you or led you to this decision? Because we knew this was an option, but we also saw that ADC was taking its time.
Yes.
To take this decision.
Yes. Well, deciding to handle a disagreement or a dispute by going to court or by going to arbitration is not an easy decision or one to be taken lightly, because international arbitration takes a long time, it costs a lot of money, and there's always uncertainty in any kind of litigation or arbitration. So we made effort after effort, many efforts, outreach, phone calls, meetings, to try to gain the government support for bringing in new investors, and it wasn't working. And force majeure actually required them to sit down and continue negotiating with us to resolve the force majeure problem. The force majeure problem being their utter lack of cooperation in obtaining the last investor that was needed for the project. They did not negotiate in good faith. There were a couple of meetings that really led nowhere. And so when there was a final deadline of the end of the year, after that deadline, they declared a termination of the agreement. After that, we began to prepare for the arbitration, because once they had terminated the agreement, then we clearly had no choice. So January, February, March, we were preparing seriously for the arbitration. And then the COVID crisis came. And everybody knows that the government was deeply engaged in handling the crisis. I think most of us agree that the government did a competent job of handling the crisis. And we did not want, as good corporate citizens and as individual citizens, I'm a citizen of Georgia and the United States, to distract the government from the job that it had.
But somewhere in between, we remember from the head of ADC that there were some hopes that this cooperation could be resumed.
After a certain point, it was clear that the only hope for making the project work and come together was if the government would signal, as it had promised to do, would communicate to a major investor that it was ready to support them in the project. We brought to them two new investors who were great investors for this project. One of them they were openly rude to in a meeting in Meyer office. This was the Hong Kong company, a Hong Kong investor. I've never seen anything like this in my many years' experience here of bringing foreign investors to the Georgian government. This was a perfectly credible company. As for the American company, a large private equity fund, had made it clear that they needed to receive a clear, unambiguous signal that the government supported this project. So we had to work out business terms with that partner. We were willing to agree to business terms that were very favorable to that partner, but the signal of support never came from the government. The one essential piece for getting that investor into the project never came.
Do you see the reason why that happened? And is this reason, or could the reason that they are saying that ADC couldn't meet the deadlines could be a serious case for the court?
The reason that yes, they say that the reason that they terminated the agreement is because we couldn't meet the deadlines, but they are the ones who undermined our ability to meet the deadlines. Within about a month or two after we had gotten mandate letters from IFIs, they brought money laundering charges against Badri Japaridze and Mamuka Khazaradze. Money laundering charges that Transparency International and the public defender, the Human Rights Ombudsman of Georgia, have both done legal analyses of and have said are baseless. Now, the government knows very well, and people at the top of the government know very well, that when you bring money laundering criminal charges against somebody, it makes them toxic for public international funds and international development. And money laundering charges in particular in the financing sector and in the corporate sector are seen as particularly bad. Not long after we made a very important step forward with an American equity investor back in May or June of 2019, all of a sudden they issued a land use permit for Poti Port to build a deep water port at Poti. And that scared everybody in our project because there's not enough of a market for more than one deep water port on Georgia's Black Sea coast. Okay, that's why the government itself picked Anaklia, and in 2014 this government picked Anaklia. And when in June or so of 2019, all of a sudden they issue a land use document for Poti to build a deep water port at Poti, our terminal operator, SSA Marine, was like, whoa, if that's going to happen, then we're going to have a real business problem, okay? Because there's not a market here for more than one port. So that caused them to escalate their demands. That was a very negative signal to the American investor that we had, the private equity fund. So I think they were very clever in picking because they knew what was going on, because we had to inform them all along the way. Here is something from the international banks, here is a new investor that we have. They knew exactly what we were doing because we had to inform them, and it was possible for them to time actions so that they disrupted that process. Based on comments that Mr. Ivanishvili made to Badri and Mamuka, based on statements that the government made, based on statements that AP Mahler Terminals made, which is the owner of Poti Port, I think it's pretty clear that there was a campaign by AP Mahler Terminals and by certain Georgian business people to obstruct the construction of Anaklia.
Who do you mean under business people?
I do not want to be explicit at this point. But this kind of thing will come out in the arbitration and in evidence in the arbitration. And there is some, let's say, strong suspicion of Mr. Ivanishvili himself having personal interests in the development of the area around Poti Port, the development of the district. And the thing is that Mr. Ivanishvili himself mentioned Poti Port a number of times. Why aren't you doing Poti Port? Now, it's quite interesting that his own government for 3 years had been developing Anaklia, and then all of a sudden he wakes up and says, why aren't you doing Poti Port? Well, why did he suddenly have that change of mind? I also think that there has been a strong Russian interest in opposing Anaklia. I will tell you that when I first came on the board a year ago, and this was one of the reasons that we were considering and discussing, I said, I don't buy that reason. I don't believe it. Because the government's been developed. Yeah. And I thought, it's probably more likely that it's some personal issue between Bidzina and Mamuka or something like that. Over time, based on things that I heard some government people say informally, myself, based on statements that representatives of the Russian government made, based on some statements that will be in evidence in the arbitration case that were heard from Georgian government people. Apparently the Russians made it clear themselves in public statements that they didn't want a big American project right there on the border with Abkhazia.
We also heard Pompeo's message.
So there's no question that Anaklia is very much a part of the economic and political integration of Georgia into the West. That is exactly why the Russians don't like it, and they didn't like the pipelines either. And they've been explicit that they don't like Anaklia, the Russians, that they don't like it for that reason. And Pompeo's statements and actions, and as an American I'm very appreciative of it, are exactly because he understands what U.S. strategic and foreign policy
and I
interests
also
are.
mentioned it that there cannot be any questions whether this was lobbied or not, like questions arise for Frontera, for example, because it wasn't lobbied.
Our lobbying has been based on facts and has been based on an analytical framework that these people, these counterparts in the West, understand. We have gotten now an American PR consultant, and that's public information. The company's called G7, but it's not a lobbying firm. He doesn't do lobbying. He helps us to develop
strategy.
He helps us
communication
develop our strategy
strategy.
and communications. He's basically a communications advisor, but we do not have a lobbying firm.
Yeah. So what should we be looking at now?
We have filed a request. We have filed a request for arbitration in the ICC, Court of International Arbitration. That's the ADC claim, and Bob Meyer has filed a personal claim as a Dutch citizen against the government of Georgia under the Dutch-Georgia Bilateral Investment Treaty in ICSID, which is in Washington, D.C. So there's two cases. I hope there's a settlement here. You know, we don't want to get $1 billion from the Georgian government. That's really the last thing that we want. We have to do it to protect our legal rights. We have to make this claim. What we want, both for ourselves as well as for the country, is to build this project and to develop this project and do this project and have the government get its head right about doing this project.
I wrote today on the Facebook that despite the outcome, this will be the case that will probably get into textbooks.
Yes.
This will be a very, very, very interesting
It is a very interesting
case.